cold and desolate, sunless place, a realm of monsters and incomprehensible sights. The recording you will hear this evening was found on a tape clutched in the hands of the frozen corpse of a Viking found on a beach in Greenland by the Norwegian explorer Hans Schmu. The voices in these tapes have never been identified. Their fates have never been verified. I would advise all listeners to listen to the following chilling broadcast at your own peril. And please, please, try to stay sane. And now, a word from our sponsors.
Are you tired of constant feuding? Sheep herding getting you down? Tired of living in a country that has a sad name like Iceland? If you want a better life, you have to come to Greenland. That's right, the all-new settlement. I'm Leif Erikson, and I'm here to tell you that life can be better. You there, emancipated child.
Oh, are you talking to me?
That's right. I'm here to tell you about the hot new city, Western Settlement. You thought Eastern Settlement had it going on. The all-new Western Settlement. Now with all new activities, clubbing, seals, and disco, bay.
Will I get to grow up to be a walrus hunter like me father?
I can't guarantee that you'll survive the trip over, but if you do, I can't guarantee that you won't die of starvation, but if you don't...
Or die of walrus?
Yes. Are you excited to go clubbing, little boy?
I feel right up for it, I do.
Take this stick and come with me to Greenland, the hot new place. Important note, ingesting Greenland may cause slow death by freezing, fast death by drowning, ice flows, flowing ice, involuntary combustion, voluntary combustion, bells bonging, self-inflicted harpoon injuries, traveling to America.
Inuit-inflicted harpoon injuries.
Getting kidnapped, possibly. Disappearing from the face of the earth with no clear reason why or how.
Welcome back to the Weird Medieval Guys podcast. This is going to be our coldest episode yet.
I'm freezing.
I'm glad we decided to record this on an ice float in the balmy environs of northern Greenland.
Well, listen, it's a little bit snug in here because it's not a very big ice floe, and there's a polar bear on the ice floe over there that's looking at us very hungrily.
I wouldn't worry. As we all know, polar bears can't swim.
That's right. This time, we're going to the far north. The Arctic, the land of the midnight sun.
Funnels, Gilver, etc.
What?
Is that too northern?
What?
The far north. Like the north, you know?
Oh.
You told me you were getting me on because we were talking about the north.
That's right. On this episode, we are going further north than any civilized human has gone before.
What, Harrogate?
Leicestershire. That's right. In particular, we're going to be talking about Vikings in the far north. And the expansion of Vikings across Northern Europe and the North Atlantic, all the way to...
America.
That's right. So this is...
Well, Canada.
Yes.
But they didn't know about Canada at the time.
Well, don't say that to anyone that's not from the United States, but is from the Americas, because they'll say... That's, you know...
They'll fight you.
They'll fight you.
They'll
say we're Americans,
I'll fight them all.
too.
I'll fight all 500 million of them. I do not care.
I'm looking across to the other iceberg where they're having a Canadian, Mexican, South American meeting. They're not looking very happy.
They're whispering and pointing at you.
I will fight every Brazilian.
That
I do not
Mountie
care.
is loading a revolver currently.
So if you, like Aran and I, were ever a little American child, you're probably taught that Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, thus becoming the first ever European to reach the Americas. Now, as we know now, that's not strictly the case.
It's news to me. The English schooling system has failed me greatly. I just found out there's another continent.
So actually, for 200 or 300 years, there was discussion that Leif Erikson and a team of Vikings had reached North America and had attempted to set up a colony there. And this was all based on Viking sources, but for hundreds of years, no one could quite prove it. And this absolutely pissed scholars off. They were talking about it constantly, all the way up until 1965, when a husband and wife team of archaeologists basically got in a little boat and just sailed around the coast of Canada, going into villages and asking people if they had any Viking settlements in their village.
Because apparently in that 200 years, no one had thought to check.
You find yourself a partner who'll travel in a tiny boat with you around the Canadian coast.
It's the sort of thing that either makes or breaks a relationship, doesn't it?
Until they reached the village of Lens-aux-Meadows and found exactly what they were looking for, which is absolutely wild. They found an archaeological site with loads and loads of old remnants of buildings and artifacts that were indisputably Norse. And this was absolutely huge because, like I said before, people have been talking about this for literally centuries. And not without good reason, because the textual evidence from Icelandic sources and from other Norse sources kept talking about this mythical land to the west that was filled with all of these creatures, Arctic foxes, and giant whales, and
lots and lots of vines.
Lots and lots of vines and rivers
Grapes.
Filled with salmon. This magical, mythical place. And for hundreds and hundreds of years, there had been no proof that this place had even existed, let alone that it was actually Canada. Until now.
Finally, proof of the existence of Canada.
Yeah, and to be fair to the 19th and 20th century scholars who were debating this, it's not like the Viking sources that attested to this place are particularly reliable for a couple of reasons. Number one, because they're mainly come from the most of the accounts that we get come from a couple of Norse sagas, and sagas are oral histories that were transmitted orally for hundreds of years, potentially, before they were ever written down for the first time. And what that means is that you get transmission effects. So a storyteller, an oral storyteller, is a much more active participant than somebody who just reproduces a text. It could be that in a sort of Chinese whispers style chain, over the generations, the Viking accounts were manipulated to fit certain contexts, to insert more modern messages that sort of fit the political and cultural context of the time. That's kind of the main issue with oral history. And the other issue is, of course, that Viking sagas are full of what historians call magical bullshit, which is they are full of supernatural elements and things that are either, we know now not to be true, or that are not always necessarily meant to be taken literally.
What the so-called scientists don't want you to know about. Like the fact that we all live in a big tree. Or the fact that apparently mistletoe's poisonous. I'm eating it right now, I don't see a problem.
It tastes incredible.
Yeah. That Mountie gave me some.
Yeah, so in particular, we have two main sources that form this group of texts that's known as the Vinland sagas. Vinland being the word that these Norse travelers used to describe this strange new land they had supposedly come upon. And so one of them is the saga of the Greenlanders, and one of them is the saga of Eric the Red. And both of these were written down in the 13th century, but refer to events that took place about 200 years before they were written. And not only that, but we don't actually know which one of these texts is older. Most scholars think that it's the saga of the Greenlanders, but this introduces all sorts of complications because we don't know whether one might have influenced the other and how exactly these texts stand in relation to each other. Because the Vikings are a largely pre-literate society. They don't have a written literary tradition, so they carve runes onto rocks and sticks, but the runes are mostly just kind of short messages that
Halfdan was here.
Yeah, that you say someone died here, or someone had sex here. Or...
These runes are very high up.
Exactly.
The stone is Bluetooth compatible.
Yeah, exactly. So until long after the events that we're going to discuss took place, there weren't any written stories. And it's only thanks to the fact that Icelandic people got really into writing down their stories, like much, much more so than anywhere else in Northern Europe, that we have these written accounts now. But despite the issues with taking these texts at face value, which is something we're not going to do,
Are we not?
That was my plan.
the commonalities between these two texts and the ways in which they can be interpreted to refer to the real world and to real life geographical locations, it was so compelling that it was a really hard idea for people to put down that Vikings had been to the Americas 500 years before any other Europeans had. So we're going to be referring to these sagas quite a bit because they're basically the only, they're not even primary sources, but they're basically the most reliable sources that we have about these events, and one of the only things we can use to figure out what happened in addition to the archaeological record. And I think at this point the broad strokes of what events unfolded and roughly where are pretty well established, but that being said, every time we refer to these sagas, it doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about something that really actually happened in real life.
Yeah, and as we will see, I think even things that may have happened in real life have very clearly been given a different sheen and a different context. And sometimes it's quite obvious, shall we say.
And have you tried reading the archaeological record? It's all just shit about, like, ice cores and tree ring dating, like that means anything.
One of the reasons, why these Viking sagas remained so compelling, people tried to sort of figure out what one of the reasons why people spent so much time trying to figure out what of it was actually real is because there is an unsolved mystery at the heart of this story. Which is to say that these sagas depict the sort of establishment of the Viking settlement in Greenland, or I should say settlements, because there were two sort of towns on the west coast of Greenland, established by the Vikings in around the 11th century, that lasted for about 500 years, until, mysteriously, they just vanished. The last written event that we have on the historical record occurring in Greenland is in 1408, and then there's over 100 years of nothing, and then we have a possibly apocryphal story about a group of Icelandic fishermen who were sailing up the Greenlandic coast, and they came across this beach, and they found the body of this old Viking lying dead on the beach, frozen stiff, perfectly preserved for all time. And so people have spent the last 500 years asking, what the hell happened?
Microplastics. It's real danger.
No, something that bad gotta be macroplastics.
Imagine a bigger plastic.
The last reports coming out of Greenland report the discovery of some kind of plastic bag. It's really fun to place over your head.
He had one of those beer can rings around his neck. Like a baby seal, he never stood a chance.
He had a drunken pack of Carlsberg and a plastic ring around his neck. That's not just it's the mystery, and it's also a failure. You know, it's a society that dropped off the face of the earth, and we don't entirely know why.
Settle in and join us in our longboat as we go on a journey to the far north.
Go north, there's ice up there.
Go north, also a polar bear.
So before the 8th or 9th century, Iceland was uninhabited, to the best of our knowledge. And around that time, we have records of the first Norsemen moving there and setting up colonies, mostly coming from, I think, Norway and Denmark. And within a few hundred years, the population of Iceland exploded. So by around the year 1000, there were at least 50,000 people living there, and they had evolved into a culture that was still Norse, still what we could group as being a Viking culture, but also had its own distinct identity and was developing its own distinct language, and especially had its own distinct legal system, which was a kind of anarcho-capitalism that, to me, is kind of like a reverse, like, the Purge situation, where they have laws for, 2 weeks of the year, and the rest of the time it's kind of just, free reign.
Sounds like it worked great.
Well, what happened was, every so often, you'd go and you'd sit in a big field, and they'd call a thing called the All Thing, and that was the sort of the parliament, kind of, and they decide all the laws, and then they do them.
Yeah, I have a quote here about it, I think that sums it up quite nicely, from, withhold your laughter, libertarian scholar Roderick Long.
Wait, is he called?
Rod Long?
Rod Dick Long.
Sorry.
He says, the legal system's administration, insofar as it had one, lay in the hands of a parliament of about 40 officers, whom historians call, however inadequately, chieftains. The parliament had no budget and no employees. It met only 2 weeks per year. In addition to their parliamentary role, chieftains were empowered in their local districts to appoint judges and keep the peace. The enforcement of judicial decisions was largely a matter of self-help, but those who lacked the might to enforce their rights could sell their court-decreed claims for compensation to someone more powerful. The basis of a chieftain's power within the political order was the power he already possessed outside it, in civil society. The office of a chieftaincy was private property and could be bought or sold. So, essentially, you have this system where, you have judges who meet for 2 weeks a year, make all of the legal decisions that have accumulated over the past year, and then basically say, you're on your own. You know, if some guy
follow these if you want.
If some guy stole your cow, they would bang a gavel and say, you should have your cow back. Good luck. See you in 1 year.
I'm sure this caused no social problems whatsoever.
Well,
things were settled over the perfect medium that is the free market.
I think you say the blockchain.
Which was a chain of ice blocks.
That kept people from fleeing libertarian Iceland.
They would chain you to the block and then push you out to sea.
That's what happened to Eric the Red.
Oh my, I'm so glad I'm a member of the non-fungible thing.
Yeah, which is why you get, quite a lot of... Unsurprisingly, this system, I'd say, creates a lot of bandits. People who are just running around causing mayhem. And which is why I think you get a lot of people who just get kicked out of Iceland, because the Icelanders collectively decide, okay, I know we don't really do, government and laws and such like that, but, this is too far. You can't just go around cutting people's heads off.
We may have come here because apparently we were so sick of Harold Fairhair that he chased us out of Norway. But you still suck. You're ruining the vibe. I wanted to come here to be free, but you keep feeding all the bears, and now they're coming into town all the time.
Yeah, which I feel like it tells us a little bit about the society that some of the central figures of our story have grown up in, that it's extremely clan-based, kind of by necessity, because having a group of people who are going to fight on your behalf is basically the only way to get by in this world. And so it is, I think, a pretty brutal, tough world to grow up in, and you have to be a pretty enterprising, charismatic guy to succeed in it.
And just like every society, it's built on the backs of the blood of Scots and Irish.
Who were brought there as plentiful slaves.
Yeah.
So, enter one of our first big players. Eric. Okay, so according to the Icelandic sagas, Eric, who is also known in particular by his byname Eric the Red, which makes him sound really cool. Apparently that was his name because he was ginger, which makes him less cool again, but that's okay. He was still a cool guy, and he was apparently responsible for establishing the first permanent Norse colony in Greenland. He was a first-generation Icelander. His father had been exiled from Norway for reasons that in the sagas are simply referred to as a bit of manslaughter.
Just a little bit.
As a treat.
Or one of the translations I read said because of some killing.
Which seems fair.
So Eric's father flees Norway for Iceland with the then 10-year-old Eric, who grows up in Iceland, soon becomes a strapping young man who is exiled himself from Iceland.
They're just getting bounced further and further west every generation.
Also for killing people.
Well, in a case that might be familiar to most English people, it starts with a garden boundary dispute. So, as some of Eric, obviously we don't have the exact specifics, but unfortunately some of Eric the Red's slaves caused a landslide onto his neighbours' lands, which, you know, wouldn't have been a big issue. Maybe he could have raised it at the thing every year, but he decided to take the direct route and just kill some of the thralls. Which, you know, you think, okay, right, fair enough. They caused a landslide, you killed some people, we're even. Eric the Red, he thinks, fuck that, I'm getting my bit. And kills the guy.
Now, killing Scottish people is one thing.
As you can see, the cycle of violence is quite intense already.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, the solution, because obviously with quite a weak central authority, a big factor in a lot of Norse violence was the starting of a blood feud. This could go on for generations, you know, starts off like you accidentally walk over somebody's pansies, he has a bit of shout at you, you know, you say something unfair about his mother, he's chopped your head off, your mum comes back and kills his mum. Goes on for decades. Better solution is, you just leave. Just walk away.
And that's exactly what he did.
Yes, he basically gathered all of his mates together and said, hey, you know that mysterious island to the north that has been the subject of a few prior attempts to colonize it unsuccessfully? I think we should go for it. And I think it's a testament to his character and to his position in the community that evidently a bunch of people just said, yeah, sure, we'll go with you into exile.
Into exile, by the way, from Iceland, going further north, which is quite a proposition.
Well,
There's not much that's further north than Iceland.
I really like that you killed Landside Glegg. Like, I was such an asshole.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound necessarily desirable, but after sailing around this land for a few years, I think his exile term is 3 years, Eric returns to Iceland and tells them of this land which he has given a shiny new name. That's right, they got a rebrand, and now this place is known as Greenland.
Greenland.
Now, if anybody who's ever flown over or visited Greenland, and I've done the first of those,
Or looked at Google Maps.
you will notice one very important thing about
Or has
Greenland
a very
visually
basic understanding of the Arctic Circle.
is that it is not very green. It is, in fact, ironically, covered in ice. But that was a very deliberate marketing ploy by Eric the Red, because he clearly, you know, I would say, even though if I would sort of peel back the layers of his brain and trying to to understand what he was thinking in trying to market it as this green and pleasant land and not a frigid nightmare realm filled with monsters, he arguably, even though he's no longer legally obliged to not be in Iceland, there's probably quite a lot of people who don't like him, and it probably works much better for him to set himself up as the petty lord of Greenland, where he can sort of rule the roost, as opposed to trying to reintegrate into Icelandic society, where everybody remembers all that stuff he did 3 years ago.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We actually have a quote from one of the Vinland sagas, the saga of Eric the Red, that says, he called the island Greenland, because, said he, men will desire much the more to go there if the land has a good name.
In many ways, it's a sign of good leadership. It's an art lost in this one world, that you just lie. You know, things aren't looking good, but you need to get people to do stuff. You don't tell them the truth. What's that going to do?
Yeah, and I think it's also, this came at a time when there was a lot of Norse expansion across Europe, not just to the north and the west, but also to the south and the east. Vikings were finding their way to Constantinople, for instance.
Woo! And also to Baghdad. And so Iceland, and soon to be Greenland, was just the latest and most westerly link in this continent-spanning, globalized trade chain that linked the Viking world down through the kind of the mountains of Scandinavia, along the epic rivers of Central Europe, and all the way into the Black Sea.
And Scunthorpe. Hey, if you can convince people to go to England, you can convince them to go anywhere. And 22 boats set off for Greenland, and it went great.
Well, it went pretty good initially.
Yeah, half of them made it. I think the sagas say that Eric the Red, he set off with about 22 boats altogether at the start of his journey, and they had about 11 when he showed up.
50%, that's a coin flip.
And do you want to flip a coin and see if you got through?
And once they get there, it actually turns out, if you're willing to be very, very, very specialized, you can make quite a lot of money in Greenland, because Greenland has a very important natural resource that the rest of Northern Europe is either running out of or has run out of.
So important that it had been wiped out in Iceland.
Yes, because they didn't really understand sustainable hunting practices, which is walrus ivory. So walrus ivory is like regular ivory, is an incredibly valuable thing because you can make cool stuff out of it that looks cool. Like, for example, the Lewis chess pieces, which are this very cool Viking chess set with lots of little Viking guys who are they're biting their shields, and it's made out of walrus ivory.
That's
now,
sick.
They are. Anyway, Iceland ran out of walruses, but you know what Greenland has to this day in abundance?
No, Aaron, what do they have?
Many, many walruses.
Holy shit.
So, the trade in walrus ivory, as well as other animal byproducts like narwhal horns, which you can pass off as unicorn horns for tremendous, tremendous amounts of money. And so you can trade that for the things that you definitely can't get in Greenland, like grain and wine and nice things like this. Fun fact, by the way, about the early Greenland settlements. I have it on, well, I have read, I don't know, as we know, I don't know how apocryphal this is, but I have read in some of the sources that some historians think that the Greenlanders that the Iceland settlers basically disassembled their houses and then reassembled them in Greenland. So they basically invented IKEA in the 11th century.
Take that, Swedes.
Well, there was a story about Eric the Red. Apparently, one of the sort of complicating factors in his life in Iceland was that he had like generational beef with a guy about a set of decorative columns. So yeah, I think I can imagine it.
He was a very belligerent guy.
He was.
I think Viking society did have some belligerent aspects.
You think?
Perhaps.
I think so. I mean, I think it's you know, obviously obviously it's part of the popular understanding of Vikings.
Lots of people bashing each other on the head with big sticks and going, huzzah!
But I think it really is, I think, one of the, when we talk about all of these people just deciding to set sail for lands unknown, to set up these colonies where they're going to eke out the most meager, miserable existence possible.
We know for a fact the bone record, goddammit. The osteology from burials shows that, like, the bones are very worn down of most people there. You know, like, it's very hard labour. You saw a lot of worn down teeth from them being used as tools as well, to, like, you know, tear shit up when you don't have a knife.
Can I raise my hand
Yeah.
and make the first of what will be many comparisons to the later phase, as in the post-1500 phase of European colonization of North America, which is that once again we have the people who are attracted to the New World to colonize it are in many ways the sort of malcontents and miscreants who are just sort of sent to the frontier to go and live in big wood houses and try and make a go of it, because let's be honest, the motherland doesn't really want them.
You just can't be normal in society.
Well, what? Australia was a prison colony. You know?
Still is, as
Still
far
is,
as I'm
yeah.
concerned.
Take that, Australians.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, we kind of have to assume, I think, like, an innate degree of, I don't know, Viking chutzpah in order to understand why these events unfolded, why people felt driven to push, beyond the frontiers of their known world.
And doing it repeatedly as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Eric the Red isn't the last generation in his family.
Like many people, he had a child.
Eric the Red had sex. Sometimes.
At least once.
That sex led to children.
Shocking research here. It's just been found out they've recently translated some new sagas. The proof is in. Eric the Red fucked.
One of the only sources we have on Eric the Red's sex life is actually that his wife stopped having sex with him because he wouldn't convert to Christianity.
Which brings us to a very important point about the Vikings in this period, which is that we've alluded to this before in previous episodes, but this is happening at this important hinge point when the Vikings are becoming Christian, and very importantly, many of them are doing so as an individual decision.
Yes.
For a multitude of reasons, but there is no, like, law that gets passed down, because, again, it's this weird anarcho-feudalist society that, where there is no central authority that can impose Christianity. It is a matter of personal conversion.
They just keep shipping in priests from Norway.
Yeah.
They won't stop doing it.
And they keep trying to chase them away, and it doesn't work.
Yeah. They keep hiding in the hills.
Yeah, so it's one of the first stories, it's kind of a fascinating little anecdote we get about Eric the Red, which I think you can kind of maybe make sense of as some of the later Christian Icelandic saga authors trying to synthesize together these two worlds, the pagan worlds from which they descend quite recently and from which they're deriving a lot of their identity and their legitimacy, and also the Christian world, which they're now part of, by telling us these anecdotes about the Vikings converting to Christianity, and in this case about Eric the Red's wife refusing to have sex with him until he did so. But yeah, I think it's on its own quite a striking story of, a man and a woman. One of them converts to one religion and the other doesn't. And they're still married and, going about their own lives. You wouldn't necessarily have that in Christian mainland Europe.
No, it's one of the things that I think is very interesting about the sagas is that the depiction of Christianity does not really follow the formulaic medieval sort of narratives about Christianity. So, for example, in I believe the saga of the Greenlanders, there is a conversion narrative because Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, at one point he goes to Trondheim, and in a very perfunctory way, they're just like, oh, and he converted. He had one conversation with the king and he converted. There's no depiction, there's no sense of personal revelation or anything like that. Because usually, if this was like in France, they'd be like, and then an angel came down and spake unto him. But there's no spaking unto anyone. Yeah. He's just like, yeah, whatever, I'll do Jesus.
That's kind of hard to be on the road to Damascus when it's so far away.
Then, I mean, you've mentioned Leif Erikson. I think maybe now is the right time to introduce him to the scene as well. I'm going to use the word that you used to describe him when we were talking about him earlier this week, off air, which is, he's a bit of a pimp. Yeah, I mean, he's a little bit of a maniac. Like, I think he's this kind of adventurous young guy who I suspect probably does feel the weight of coming from this dynasty of, like, high-powered exile, explorers.
Real weird medieval guy heads might notice the little clue to his parentage.
The sagas don't agree as to whether or not Leif Erikson is the guy who first arrives in North America.
Yeah, they say this Christopher Columbus guy is knocking around.
I will throw you out of this building. Don't use that name in here. So, one of the Greenland saga sort of says that there's another guy who gets blown off course and winds up on this weird island, and he comes back to Greenland being like, there's some stuff over there. And in another version, it is Leif who gets blown off course and ends up on this weird island.
Whichever one the real story is, if either one is the real story, ostensibly, according to the sagas, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, over the course of what can only be a many, many months long voyage, washes up on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So this is a strange new land, as it's written in the sagas. It's not like Greenland at all. It's not icy. It's not barren. It's actually, according to many of these sources, a land that's very plentiful. There's wild grapes growing, all sorts of wild crops just flourishing for them to take. The rivers are running thick with salmon. There are white foxes and wild birds and all sorts of animals. There are strange creatures, types of fish and whales they've never seen before that wash up on the beaches. In one of the stories, they try to cook one of them and it makes them sick.
One of the first lines about this land in the saga of the Greenlanders actually sums this up in a very evocative way, where it says that there they went ashore and looked about them, the weather being fine, and they observed there was dew upon the grass, and it so happened that they touched the dew with their hands, and touched their hands to their mouths, and it seemed to them that they had never before tasted anything so sweet as this. One of the people who Leif is traveling with is his foster father, a German called Turke, who, by the way, gets a physical description in the saga that says that he has a prominent forehead, restless eyes, small features, was short in stature, and a frail-looking man. Not a glowing portrait. Anyway, so he sort of they are trying to set up camp, and the Turker has been sort of off doing his own thing. And Leif asks him, "Why are you so late, foster father, and separated from the others?" At first, Turker spoke for some time in German. Yeah, that's right. One of the first people in North America was a German. Take that, Italians. Turker spoke for some time in German, rolling his eyes and grinning, and they could not understand him, but after a while he addressed them in Norse. "I did not go much farther than you, but I have news to relate. I have found vines and grapes." "Is this true, foster father?" said Leif. "I am certain," he said, "because I was born where there is no lack of either grapes or vines." They slept through the night, and the next day Leif said to his shipmates, "We will now divide our labors, and each day we'll either gather grapes or cut vines and fell trees in order to obtain a cargo of these for my ship." A cargo sufficient for the ship was cut, and when the spring came, they made their ship ready and sailed away, and from its products Leif gave the land a name, and called it Vinland. So I think that, again, we have to make another comparison with American frontier literature, we have this sense of, like, infinite bounty. Mm-hmm. From the very start, that there is this kind of, like, there's just, like, honey dripping from the trees wherever you go. Fat little animals you can just pick up.
It's just...
and eat raw.
It's just untouched, unspoilt wilderness.
Yeah.
With no one else there.
Well, or is there?
And so, this name Vinland, I believe, appears in both of the Vinland sagas. But this is one of the most contentious and befuddling parts of the sagas, because... to harken back to our opening, none of the archaeological evidence of where the Vikings, none of the archaeological evidence that was found of Viking presence was found in places where wild grapes grow. So we talked about Newfoundland, which is an island off the coast of Canada.
Not a famous wine region.
No, not at all.
I need to talk to my real estate.
So... for a long time before the Viking presence in the Americas was confirmed, there were theories that they had washed up somewhere like Massachusetts.
Woo!
Oh my god. Go Sox! Yankees suck!
Or somewhere else in New England, although I believe
Go Pats!
Or somewhere else in New England. I will kill you. Or perhaps more likely, somewhere like New Brunswick, where wild grapes are known to grow. So this is significant because, although Viking presence is attested in Newfoundland, it's possible that they explored much, much more of the east coast of the Americas. especially because there was all sorts of evidence found at this site in Newfoundland. They had been consuming goods that grew elsewhere in the Americas. So plants and nuts and seeds that grew not in Newfoundland, but much further south were found there. And the only explanations that are possible for this are that they were found by the Vikings and brought back there, or potentially that the Vikings had gotten them from someone.
And it's funny you should say that, because this is pretty much exactly where another people, or peoples, enter the narrative, because this is where we get the first written descriptions of contact between Europeans and indigenous Americans. And these come in the second or potentially third, depending on what saga you're listening to, expedition to Vinland, where it's led by Leif's brother Torvald. If Leif takes after his father's sort of adventurous spirit and love of discovery, Torvald takes after the sort of more murdery side of his father's character.
Leif engaged in the free exchange of goods and
ideas
on the market, whereas Goofus, Torvald, violated the non-aggression principle and for his troubles.
So Torvald, the Greenland saga describes a moment when Torvald is sailing down the coast and he spies these 8 men who are sitting on a beach, sitting next to their boats, just basically hanging out. And, if we freeze frame that for a second, this is an incredible moment in world history. This is the first interactions that we have written down, recorded, where Europeans meet Native Americans.
Well, I think it's an astonishing moment for him, but I think it would be wrong to say that this is something that he never would have expected.
No.
Because there are other people on Greenland before the Vikings get there. All of the history.
And Vikings, everywhere Vikings go, they meet new people.
I think all of or most of the history of human expansion is also one of conflict, and in the Greenlander saga, it's mentioned a few times before this point. They were sailing up and down the coast, but they didn't meet anyone, and they didn't see anything that stuck out. And I think that I can imagine they would have been wondering when an encounter like this would happen.
Yeah. And so how does he respond in this pivotal moment of first contact between two civilizations? He says, "All right, boys, let's kill these guys." So they kill 7 of them, and one of them gets away. And Torvald says, "All right, job done." So they
I assume we killed everybody on this continent. Time to sit back and enjoy my beer.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, shortly afterwards, a large army of men with bows descends upon them, and Torvald's men have to flee, basically, but not before Torvald gets hit with an arrow to the chest that literally pins him to his boat. And so he's done. He knows he's dying. And he says to his men, bury me, once we're safe, you should bury me with a cross at my head and a cross at my feet. And
I was a good Christian. All my favourite 9 commandments.
Well, the way, if I may interject, the way that this episode is recounted in the Greenlander saga is also quite funny to me. I'm just going to read from this translation. I'll link the translations for both of these sagas. And this is after the battle. Torvald then asked his men whether any of them had been wounded, and they informed him that none of them had received a wound. "I have been wounded in my armpit," he says. "Here is the shaft, and it will bring me to my end." I just like the idea of him bleeding profusely from, a major artery, and he's like, "Are you guys okay?" Because, you can just imagine him, dying for them to ask him about the
it's like the guy in a zombie movie who gets bitten
and
doesn't talk about it.
He's really eager to bring up injuries because he's got a new exciting one that he wants to talk about.
It's the classic social technique. If you want to talk about your thing, you ask people about their lives to trick them into asking you about yours. That's basically how most of my conversations work.
Any cool injuries recently? Lifts, arms, blood.
Let me just scratch the top of my head.
as I'm pinned to this boat.
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, Torvald obviously was not a particularly cuddly guy, but I think, he is fascinating because his grave is the first recorded Christian burial anywhere in the American continent. That's crazy. I mean, imagine that just sitting there for 500 years.
Yeah.
He's the loneliest soul in the universe.
I mean, it seems Torvald sort of talked shit, got a hit.
Yeah.
He had it coming. So there's one last recorded Viking expedition after Torvald's into Vinland. Basically, this guy called Karlsefni asks Leif if he can borrow his house, essentially, and just stay there and explore Vinland and see what's going on. So they go out and they sail to Leif's old settlement, and immediately there's just a beached whale just right outside their front door, which again feels a little bit too literary. Everything feels a bit too abundant, doesn't it?
Sailing along, looking at the whale thing, like, I'm sure this has some kind of metaphor that I'm not quite grasping here.
Yeah. And so they stay there for a few months. They winter over there because, I mean, there's no way of going back in midwinter. Too much ice. And in the summer following that winter, they also encounter the local people. And just a big troop of them come out of the woods. What's interesting is that this isn't followed by violence. Instead, even though they don't understand each other's languages, and that's something that's made very explicit in the text, is that neither the Norse nor the indigenous people can speak each other's language. The local people's first instinct is to basically loosen their packs and offer their stuff for barter, because they clearly operate in a society where you might encounter like other groups of people, and it's expected that you would trade.
The free market stays winning.
And so there's this remarkable moment where for a few hours, the Norse and the local people are just hanging out and trading with each other. We don't really know what happens though, because at that point the narrative shifts in the Greenland saga. While Karlsefni is out sort of negotiating, presumably in sign language, with the local people, his wife Gudrid is sitting inside and with their son Snorri. And the narrative takes a rather abrupt, non sequitur turn in a way that they never come back to it. Most Viking sagas are full of weird stuff. There are gods and there are spirits and things like that. But the Vinland sagas have been, and especially the Greenlandic saga, has been very recognizably American frontier literature, as I've been kind of talking about. Like, it's just, we went there, we built some houses, and we traded with the native people, and then they left. Whereas this section of the saga is not that. I'm going to read this in its entirety. Gudrid was sitting inside, in the doorway, beside the cradle of her infant son, Snorri, when a shadow fell upon the door, and a woman in a black garment entered. She was short in stature, and wore a shawl over her head. Her hair was light red-brown. She was pale, and her eyes were so large that never before had eyes of that size been seen in a human head. She went up to where Gudrid was seated and said, "What is your name?" "My name is Gudrid, but what is your name?" "My name is Gudrid," says she. The mistress of the house, Gudrid, motioned her with her hand to seat beside her, but it so happened that at that very instant Gudrid heard a great crash, upon which the woman vanished. And at that time, at the same moment, one of the indigenous people who had tried to seize their weapons was killed by one of Karlsefni's followers. At this, the indigenous people quickly fled, leaving their garments and trade goods behind them. And no one except Gudrid had seen this woman. Anyway, and then the story just abruptly returns to, now we gotta go and back to normal stuff.
Yeah.
Now, again, when I have to admit that I'm the most primed possible to find that freaky, because I have been raised on stories of Arctic horror that very much follow this formula of, oh, you're in a house and then there's a spooky woman shows up. Like,
what could be more scary than a woman?
Yeah.
but seriously, like, I think that this is very obviously meant to be a horror story. The description of the woman is meant to evoke the uncanny valley. We can agree on that, right?
Yeah.
Like, her eyes are a little bit too big. She's a little bit too pale. It's like, what on earth was... You're meant to go, wait, what on earth was that? And I think that speaks to a couple of things. I think it speaks to the fact that we do find, certainly in Western culture, I think we do find the Arctic to be a liminal place, a place of the uncanny, because it's a freezing place where the sun doesn't set half the year and doesn't rise the other half, and there's like magic in the sky, and everybody's going in. Everybody goes insane eventually, which is why we get like stories like one of me and Joe's favorite TV shows, The Terror, which is a great show about a bunch of sad men on a boat having a terrible time until a demon bear eats them.
Eating huge amounts of lead.
Or Michelle Paver's Dark Matter, which is a personal favorite. Just a good classic ghost story about a guy who's stuck in a research station with a ghost and is in love with his best friend. So, you might say, well, that's strange, but ultimately inconsequential. Viking stories are full of supernatural stuff.
We've all been haunted by spooky ghosts.
Yeah, especially in the Arctic.
Yeah. There's one over there on the other ice floe.
Oh, that's what that dark shape is.
In between the polar bears, the Mounties, and the
I can't stop staring at it.
Don't forget the Brazilians.
It's the spirit of my long dead husband.
I can't stop looking at its wet round head. For a long time, people have looked at the story of the two Gudrids and been like, what on earth was that? Right? But there has recently been a really interesting explanation posited, which is the whole story makes a lot of sense if you just reverse the order in which people speak. So the Norse Gudrid introduces herself, and the strange woman in black, repeats what she said. Because one of the things that Europeans always say when they meet Native Americans for the first time is that they're incredibly good at imitation, right down to intonation and accent. And so what if this horror story is actually at its core the first written account of a conversation between a European and a Native American?
Wow, that's just blown my mind right there. However you interpret it, that is, I mean, of course, a really compelling interpretation, and I think it's also, this is kind of me just putting on my, ooh, this is spooky hat as well, or my, ooh, this is interesting hat, maybe rather, but I think
How many hats have you got?
So many.
Oh, you can see them all lined up next to Liv.
Yeah.
She's got a rack.
But I think it is also, to me, quite compelling that this episode, I believe, is only recounted in the Greenlander saga.
Yes.
Which is usually agreed to be the older of the two and to have influenced the other one. So I think it's also quite interesting to imagine the possibility of subsequent generations editing out this episode and finding it unnerving. In the saga of Eric the Red, which is usually thought of as the younger of the two sagas, this episode doesn't appear. There is an episode that isn't in the other one, in which one of Leif Erikson's sisters frightens off an entire band of Native Americans by taking her top off and hitting her boobs with a sword. Which, again, this is pure conjecture and just, largely me projecting, of course, but I can imagine that being a much more appealing narrative to insert into the story.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
To give the Vikings an active role.
Give it a bit of spice,
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think that moment, it's the first moment of contact that's not primarily about violence. So whether or not the story of the two Gudrids represents, is a garbled account of the first conversation between these two, between these people, it is nevertheless, I think it's not a coincidence that this happens at the point where, there is the first real kind of trade and engagement and sustained contact, as it were, in a single episode. And I think this is a really good opportunity to sort of freeze frame and rewind and tell this whole story again from the other perspective, which is the perspective of the native peoples of Greenland and North America.
When the Vikings first settled in Greenland, people had been living there for thousands of years previously, and you'd seen some cultural change shifts between the two Independence Bay cultures that had lived far in the north. But the society they were most likely to run into contact with would have been the Dorset culture.
Which is not what they would have called themselves.
Of course.
That's an archaeological... They weren't like, "Who are my lovelies? Welcome to Greenland. Would you like a cream tea?"
Turned straight back around and gone home. So, unfortunately, they are attested to purely through their sort of material history. We have distinctive style of art, which we can see through their ivory carvings. That have often, you get a lot of animals represented, and these are distinct from what came before and what will come after. We have tool making, because there's a lot of flint knapping involved, because importantly, Greenland didn't have easy access to things like iron, copper, or tin, so there's no metalworking. Yeah, or wood, yeah, so it's all largely made out of bone, ivory, and leathers, so there's some quite advanced technologies existing there, but that's all we have evidence of. This Dorset culture, though, largely disappeared over the period that the Vikings were living on the south of Greenland. We don't entirely know why. We know that during the period, the Thule culture,
I think Thule.
Thule.
Yeah, because it's based on the German word for, like, up there.
Named after the outdoor sporting brand. More seriously, named after, I think, attested to in Aristotle, Socrates, as some kind of island in the north.
In the far north.
Yeah.
The Nazis got really into it. It's a bit... This is not related to that.
Yeah, talking about Thulian mysteries.
Yeah.
No, but that is, again, the name that has been assigned to them, and they're a proto-Inuit culture that's spread out from... Canada, sort of southern Canada, into the various islands and eventually into Greenland. So around the 1400s, we see the last of the Dorset culture disappearing, and you might start seeing some contact between the Thule and the Vikings.
Yeah, and I should say we know so little about what happened to the Dorset culture. We didn't even know if there was interactions with the Thule culture, or if they just sort of slid into the spot that the Dorset had been occupying.
Yeah.
There are some theories that there was a genocide, but I think that might be a backwards projection from modern people assuming how first contact between two cultures is always inevitably going to go. In any case, it's one of the many mysteries that we just have to put up with, I think, in this world of the far north.
I think so. I think I think it's as well particularly perplexing because I think they've done genetic studies and they've not found any evidence of DNA from the Dorset people in the Inuit, who are the modern day descendants of the Thule people. So I think that's particularly perplexing because however it may happen on a case-by-case basis, usually when two cultures meet, there is, some degree of...
Shagging.
It's a nice way of putting it.
Well, no, I mean, and interestingly, by the way, speaking of, there's also no Norse DNA in modern-day Greenlanders.
We'll come to that later on Norse mysteries.
Which, what it tells you is that we know that there was interaction and trade between the Thule and the Vikings. They weren't necessarily falling in love and having lots of babies.
It's often theorized that one of the more central places of contact would have been the previously mentioned Disco Bay, which somewhat unfortunately names, seeing as there was no disco yet. It hadn't been born yet, and it hadn't died yet either. where there were large populations of walruses that the Vikings would have travelled to about 500 miles north, because a lot of the Inuits was focused on the north of the island of Greenland. It's one of the biggest It is the biggest island in the world, isn't it?
If you don't count Australia as an island, yeah.
Yeah, I don't count Australia for a lot of reasons. But it's often theorised that a big point of contact would have been Disco Bay, where these people sailed up 500 miles to collect their walrus tusks and their leathers and blubber for harvest. We have evidence that there was interactions between the Thule and the Greenlandic Vikings through the exchange of material items. There's carvings. We find Viking carvings that have been handed out in certain Thule archaeological sites. In some Viking places, we have examples of material culture that was most likely exchanged. But perhaps more interestingly, we have it attested to in the oral culture of the Inuit that has been passed down over that period, because in the 19th century, an anthropologist did a study during the period of Arctic exploration after the so-called rediscovery of Greenland, after the settlement disappeared. People became interested in what happened, the cultures of these societies that lived, far into the Arctic Circle.
Mysteriously, this rediscovery and re-interest in indigenous culture happened to coincide with the push for the discovery of the Northwest Passage. And the commercial interest of being able to circumnavigate the North.
Yeah.
But, that's just a theory.
We're not gonna ask these guys if it's a good idea, but we are gonna bother them.
Excuse me, you sir.
Do you want to have a look at my calipers? I need to prove some weird ideas.
At a guess, what volume would you say your brain is?
How many beans are in this jar? And of course, as with any recording of oral cultures, it presents some challenges, different from those of written records. Not only is this one mediated by the guy recording the stories, but there's the fact that there is a few 100-year gap between the actual experiences and then as they were repeated to the researcher.
And this is one of the things that social researchers, whether you're an ethnographer or an anthropologist or whatever, have to cope with, is that in the recounting of oral history, the interviewer is a participant in the construction of the narrative, because people are inevitably on some level telling you what you want to hear. And the fact that you're having a conversation with somebody who is, potentially descended from these people is going to color how you present these stories, and frankly, whether or not you are inventing them on the fly because it's what he wants to hear.
Yeah. Nevertheless, though, we'll maybe go over a few of them today.
Yes, with that massive health warning. Well, because I think that they are interesting. I think they are interesting in their own right, and also they are specific enough that I think I do on some level buy them as authentic.
Yeah.
To the extent that you can call any of these authentic.
So, and the name given by the fool to the the Norse settlers would be, and I apologise for pronunciation.
I know we have at least a couple of listeners in Greenland, so if you've made it this far without throwing your phone across the congratulations. Just hold on tight.
The Cav de Lunite. Many apologies. But the first story, as goes, recounts an interaction between a man riding his kayak along the coast.
As you do to go hunt for seals.
Yeah, it's just part of life.
You're just at work, basically.
And it goes, on approaching Carcour Tok, where first the Cavad de Lunite had taken up their abode, he saw one of them gathering shells on the beach, and presently he called out to him, "Let us see whether thou canst hit me with thy lance."
Come on, bro. I bet you won't do it.
This might be an example of fucking around and finding out. The kayaker would not comply, although the other continued asking him. At last, however, the master of the place, named Ungortok, made his appearance and, since he seemed so very anxious about it, take good aim at him. And soon the kayaker sent out his spear in good earnest and killed him on the spot.
Yes!
So it's like, oh, come on, hit me, bro, hit me, hit me.
Yeah.
Very big of Ungortok, though. He says, fair enough. The guy kept asking you to throw his spear at him. I'll let you off with this one. Unfortunately, people were obviously afraid of retribution. It doesn't come. But later on, the kayaker again sees another Norseman.
He's like, I'm not falling for this again.
Besides, this time, I'm just going to throw my spear at him. Maybe these guys like this. Maybe it's like a cultural thing. I'm just going to be polite.
What they're into.
Killing him, which Ungortok does not take kindly to this time. It's quite a... I mean, and again, this is gone through 3 levels of translation. But there's an interesting piece of translation because the Norse do decide to retaliate. And it goes, since time after this occurrence, a girl was sent out to draw water in the evening. But while she was filling the pail, she noticed the reflection of something red down in the water. At first she thought it to be the reflection of her own face, but turning around, she was horrified to see the great crowd of Cadvulunate. She was so confounded that she left the pail behind and hurried into the house to tell what had happened. And this group goes on to slaughter everybody living in the house, apart from 2 brothers who make their escape. Unfortunately, the younger brother falls behind, fails to climb a sort of ice dune or like an escarpment of some kind, at which point Ungortok chops off his arm and waves it at his older brother. So the older brother, Kaisapi, looking down, sees the arm chopped off, at which point Ungortok says, "This is a sight you will not forget."
Yeah, you wouldn't.
Which, unsurprisingly, sparks a rather long tale of revenge and violence, involving Ungortok throwing his child into a lake, as opposed to leaving him to the to Kaisapi's wrath. Kaisapi disguising kayaks as icebergs to sneak up on him, and it ends with him shooting Ungortok in the face with an arrow, and then chopping his arm off and saying, "Now you won't forget this sight."
Wow.
Of course, this shouldn't characterise every interaction as one of pointless and indiscriminate violence.
I think it's fun, though, because it's clear that what I get from that story is that the Icelandic settlers brought their culture of just murdering people.
Idiotic blood feuding.
Idiotic, pointless violence.
First do no harm.
So, of course, unsurprisingly, not all interactions were violent. Another story attests to the meeting of the Fuli and the Vikings, and it says they got along quite well to the point that these 2 guys, one Fuli, one Viking, became best mates. They were great at games, especially those of dexterity, practically inseparable. And one day, the Norseman, came to the Fuli and said, "Let's have a competition. Let's make targets out of sealskin, set them down, and then climb this mountain. We'll shoot arrows and see who can hit closest to the targets." The Fuli guy, and the one who does poorly should be thrown from the top of the mountain.
Oh!
The Fuli guy,
a great game!
not wanting to see his close friend killed, tries to demur, at which point the Norseman's mates come along and say, "Let's do it. Let's be legends." It'll be great fun. So he relents, and they go to the top of the mountain. The Norseman eats shit, misses, and the Fuli guy right on target, right in the middle, at which point the Norseman's friends say, "Well, he asked for this to happen," and threw him off the top of the cliff.
That's what he would have wanted. And meanwhile, he's like, no.
He died doing what he loved. Pointless violence. Pointless, self-inflicted, self-destructive violence.
Playing games of dexterity.
Yep.
Play stupid games, win stupid prizes.
It does, again, that attests to like a far closer relationship. You know,
Yes.
to the point that these two people were quite close friends.
And they had a conversation.
Yeah, and it ends in violence.
Yeah.
But that makes a good story.
What I would get from that is just, for the vibes that I get from those stories, is just utter incomprehension.
Yeah.
By the Inuit to these, like, strange, bearded lunatics who are just like, let's go and do some violence.
Yeah.
I mean,
Why don't you kill me?
for
For
one
no
last one,
reason.
this fooly guy's kayaking down the coast, and he sees a tent with a lot of Kavad Knight settling in, having like a rowdy time. He decides to play a prank, and with his oar beats on the side of the tent, at which point all the men inside go silent. He does it again, there's no response. He opens up the tent, at which point they all run out onto the ice, fleeing for a while, until the ice, unfortunately Finn at that point, breaks open and they sink underneath, all dying.
I like how kind of like, it's very, I don't know, it's very Tom and Jerry, these
Yeah.
stories.
Yes.
There is a bit of Arctic horror, which they said thereafter, if anybody saw these Norsemen under the ice, it was a sign that someone would die soon. Which is quite spooky.
My favorite quote about traditional Inuit cosmology is one Inuit person who just sort of casually said to an ethnographer, "Yeah, oh yeah, we don't believe, we fear."
Wow.
Which I'm sorry, it's a terrifying land where everything wants to kill you.
Mhm.
You would, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So it sounds like everything's going great in the Norse settlements in Greenland. Everything's fine. This is going to last forever, baby.
Yeah.
We're never going to die.
They're hanging out with the Foolians,
Yeah.
they're having stupid competitions and getting thrown off of cliffs. This could go on forever.
They're as safe as we are on this ice floe. And have you noticed that our eye line seems to be going lower and lower as we're recording?
So almost like we're being affected by some kind of change in the climate.
Nah.
So we also have accounts on the north side of interactions with the Fool people in Greenland. At one point, the Western settlement, which previously, having been integrated into what was like a sort of larger North Sea society, which they paid taxes, they received bishops from the central state in Norway, stopped sending payments, which, while irregular, had always arrived, and so a priest, Ivar Bardason, was sent out to see what was going on, essentially. Sail across the horrible icy seas, avoid the Mounties and the ice flows, and see if he could, get the money flowing again. And when he arrives, he accounts that the Western settlement had been attacked by a large party, and some of the men had been kidnapped and people had been killed, which speaks to this more sort of violent interactions between people. And that is one of the last accounts we have before the settlement itself disappears.
Yeah. So we've been building up to this kind of central mystery of what happened to the Norse settlement in Greenland. And the truth is, I don't know if we ever will know for sure. I think there are a lot of very compelling potential theories, and I think it's quite useful to go through a few of them and kind of see if we can kind of assemble potentially a composite view about what may have happened. So we should probably start with the probably the most famous theory for why the Greenlandic Norse settlements collapsed, which was climate change. So, and this is, I'd say, most famously articulated in sort of popular history by Jared Diamond in the book Collapse. And Jared Diamond is a fairly controversial guy these days, but I think it's worth taking the idea seriously. So basically, his argument is that the Greenlandic Norse settlement in the 11th century was during a period called the medieval warm period, when global temperatures were higher than they had been. But in about the 14th century, what happens is there is a big volcanic eruption that
causes a little ice age.
yes, a small ice age. Now, Jared Diamond's theory for that is that that's what causes the Norse collapse, because he argues the Norse fundamentally, when they settled Greenland, did not adapt their behavior. The Thule and the Dorset peoples adapted their behavior enormously to suit their environment. They relied, like we mentioned before, they used bone instead of wood or metal. They relied on driftwood for whatever wood they could get. They weren't arable farmers because the growing season in Greenland is so short.
Up to this point, the Norse settlement were entirely reliant on imports of iron and timber for construction of boats. And like in one noticeable place, they had a huge bell imported for their church. But they are relying on outside forces essentially, or they're not self-sufficient.
A little bit like how the populations of Arizona and Florida skyrocket after the invention of AC. When the Norse settled, they didn't fundamentally change their way of life. They just copied their European lifestyles. And so when the climate changed, that was no longer sustainable, the settlement collapsed. Now, I would say that is pretty questionable as a theory, personally, because we do know from, their leavens, from the middens, that they actually did change their diet, so if they were hunting way more seals, and to do that, they would have had to adopt some of the Inuit hunting techniques, so, not just going out on a boat and hunting them, but, also, hole fishing and things like that. And also, the other thing is that the sudden sort of cold snap of the Little Ice Age was followed by another at least 100 years of Norse settlement, which is a pretty long time. If your social structure doesn't work with your environment, it's going to probably take a little less than 100 years for your way of life to become unsustainable. If the issue is that the ice is coming in earlier and earlier every year, cutting you off from European trade, and the growing season is getting shorter and shorter, so you can't farm as effectively as you wanted to, I think that you would probably see a much more constrained time frame for the collapse of Norse settlement if it was just that.
Yeah. Interestingly, in the sources, the primary sources that we have previously mentioned, there's no accounting of what happens in Greenland.
No.
It just sort of falls off the map. Previously, Greenland had been noted in documents such as the King's Mirror as a part of the sort of Norwegian kingdom, but eventually it sort of disappears.
Yeah, which means and also there's no record of the collapse.
Yeah.
Which means one of two things happened. Either they all died, or there was no mass exodus and it happened very, very, very slowly. That people left in dribs and drabs. Which, you do have evidence, I would say, it's slightly flimsy evidence from the way that dwellings were left, and when they were found by by explorers, that some of them are kind of messed up, some of them are quite clean, which suggests that there was a gradual fleeing.
Noticeable contraction of the layout of various settlements. They become slowly the ones on the outer fjords who were living in the sort of slightly more highland areas move in more centrally as a reaction to this harsher environment. But it's quite likely, and Karl Marx bursting into the fucking door here, that it was the goddamn economy.
Well, yeah, I mean, so that's explanation number 2, which is there was some kind of disruption with the trade with Europe, that the high-value commodities that the Greenland Norse were selling, this ivory, these tusks, these hides, these furs, were no longer selling for the same price, which means that because they're so hard to get and they require you to live in this unbelievably hostile environment. It's not viable to live there anymore.
Especially when you're so reliant on outside trade for various necessities such as iron. This links up with larger developments on the continent, as you see an opening of trade with Russia during the period, which has a vast supply of walruses of their own, which might be slightly more easily available than sailing across the North Sea. England becomes a more important player in North Sea trade as the sort of Scandinavian kingdoms have increasingly moved towards the periphery of Europe, which moves more central. You have like the fact that the seat of the Kalmar Union, which was the political centre at the time, moving from Norway to Denmark, which is a geographic move away from Greenland, essentially. There are trade routes increasingly open with access to sources of ivory in Africa, such as African elephants. All of these make the key commodity of ivory less valuable and more easily available, while Greenland sort of wilts away on the periphery.
Yeah.
Not to mention, I think, the fact that in the face of this decline in the value of ivory, it's easy to imagine them having this massive push to extract everything that they can from the landscape, thus essentially shooting themselves in the foot because now they've run out of walruses.
So it's, I mean, I think that, again, I think there is a kind of comparison to make. The way that I would compare, what I would compare the Greenlandic settlements to is it's kind of like, a post-industrial area or city or like a monotown in any kind of Western country. It was very good at making one thing, but suddenly they are no longer the most efficient suppliers of that thing. The production moves overseas, and you're left behind.
Margaret Thatcher shut down the walrus market, and now I have to work in safe ways. But and again, it leads to the interesting question of, was there a mass die-out, or did people sort of slowly emigrate in dribs and drabs? Because obviously it is quite an exciting story of maybe I think population estimates for the settlement were about 1,500 people. Most recently, they've been lowered due to recent archaeological studies of cemeteries. But the idea of these people being wiped off the face of the earth. But it's entirely possible that, especially because in this period, Iceland was going, at the start of the 15th century, Iceland was going through a lot of political upheaval, as shockingly the anarcho-libertarian environment collapsed into a sort of Hatfield and McCoy type
regular
situation.
anarchism.
Yeah. Two large clans had consolidated much of the farming land on the island and proceeded to do as they want and fight each other in a larger escalation from I'm going to kill you because there was a landslide on my land to this is disrupting taxes going to the king.
I'm pretty sure that's what Team Fortress 2 is about.
And at the same time, you see more English fishermen getting involved in the North Sea. So both these and the arrival of the Black Death.
Well, yeah, and that's explanation number 3, which is that the Black Death doesn't reach Greenland. We have no evidence from burials that I'm aware of Yersinia pestis or whatever the Black Death was in the burials. There are mass graves, but not the kind of mass graves that you see in plague sites in Europe. But it doesn't have, as we saw in the coronavirus pandemic. Pandemics are just inherently disruptive to economic activity and to trade, because when people have to stay at home, turns out if no one can go anywhere, that's bad for the economy. Yeah. And so suddenly, maybe there wasn't the demand in Europe for high value, high prestige items like walrus ivory anyway, because no one can afford it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest effects of the Black Death was that it made land massively available to people in a much more, in a much bigger way than it had been before. And so it was much, much easier to make a living in agriculture.
Also, the DPD delivery driver who dropped off the iron has died.
Yeah, I mean, and then I think explanation number 4 is violence. So obviously we know from that account that you described that the that there was at least occasional large scale conflict between the Thule people and the Norse. And by the way, those, based on the on the material culture that we have, those guys could be scary. They had like incredibly powerful composite bows. They wore this, or at least we have archaeological evidence that they wore this kind of, like, they crafted this like slate armor. It was a pretty fair fight. Like, if we think of the Vikings as like this incredibly intense martial culture, but they would not have had it their own way. However,
you can talk a lot of shit about stone, but I've seen some injuries.
yeah,
a friend of mine got hit embedded into his chest.
Yeah. So I think that there's definitely been, over the years, it is very easy to imagine that there was some kind of apocalyptic final confrontation, and there'd be wind blowing and snow everywhere, and that it would look really cool. Unfortunately, there's basically no archaeological evidence for that.
Yeah.
Like, there's no evidence that they just came in. Like, if the Thule had come in and just murdered everyone, we would know.
Unless they very fastidiously cleaned up after themselves.
Yeah.
Presumably out of fear of a later archaeological record condemning them.
We just hate for the historical record to reflect badly on our people.
No one can know we did this.
Yeah.
As you've said, there's not necessarily one specific factor we can latch on to, and the idea that this was a slow decline, possibly spurred by multiple factors, is probably the easiest one to settle on for now.
I think that makes it really hard to do what we, I think, subconsciously really want to do when we tell this story, which is trying to imagine what the final days were like. Was it an orderly sort of departure? Was it, or was it the HMS Terror and Erebus of a bunch of people just camping out and going insane in front of a mountain?
Ingesting prodigious amounts of lead.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I don't think we're ever going to get that kind of closure, because I do think that we want to. The reason why it's such a compelling question, why did the Norse settlement fail? It's not just because it tells us so much about, cultural contact and macroeconomics and things like that, but because on an emotional level, I think we want to know what they felt. And I don't think we'll ever get that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the overall impression, for me personally, that I'm left with is that of a people who were never fully at home in the land that they inhabited. I think for the same reasons that a permanent settlement in Vinland never took off. It's easy to imagine the communities that were set up just not being particularly resilient to all of these forces that we've discussed, and just being reliant on the outside world, never fully adapting to the way of life that had allowed other people to establish themselves successfully there. And I think you can, just imagine these people living there in this land that they didn't fully inhabit, and just, and not necessarily, and there just being a slow decline again, because the conditions that had allowed this to be something that was desirable and something that was profitable had long since subsided, and all that they were left with at the end of the day was just a bunch of houses in the ice.
So as we can see, there could have been various factors that contributed to the end of Norse settlement in Greenland. And while we might not know exactly what the final days were like, we can know for certain that there was a final boat that travelled and possibly picked people up. The last one we have attests to a wedding that we only know exists because they came back with the boat, as more and more people maybe were emigrating, leaving the harsh Arctic climb for a more nicer place in Iceland. But eventually there would have been a last boat, and past that point, with a failure to adapt, there would have been no way of getting out. No escape.
Yeah, and you either got on that boat or you died.
Yeah.
Well, I think that is going to draw us to a close for this episode of the Weird Medieval Guys podcast. It was a weird one, I think. We went to some places.
It was medieval.
It was pretty medieval, and
there were guys.
and it was very unsatisfying at the end because we
Yes.
couldn't answer the question.
Well,
But hopefully we learned a little thing along the way. Like if you become best buds with a Norwegian guy and you like hanging out and drinking and playing games together, and one day he wants to test you in a game of agility, maybe just say no.
If you find 7 to 8 people on a beach, don't kill them.
Yeah.
Maybe try and give them some stuff.
Do you have a lesson?
We're all just dogs barking at the door of history, asking to be let in, but history won't answer.
Sled dogs, Arctic
Yes.
reference.
Huskies.
We are. Yes.
They had those as well. They were the Inuit. They had them fucking yonks back.
Good news! I think I can see a huge White Star Line cruiser coming
Oh,
our way.
thank God, we're saved.
They'll be able to get us off this ice floe.
Yes. Off this Iceland.
Well, okay, let's wrap this
Is that Leonardo DiCaprio on the front?
I think we need to wrap this episode up then, this mysterious audio recording before we get on this boat.
Over here.
So if you liked this episode, then leave us a 5-star review or a Spotify comment, and tell your friends to listen to this strange podcast, like Bongley has, who says,
I just did mental seppuku to honour you both. My best to you. Ellipses, close brackets, close parentheses.
I need to clarify that was on the Japan episode. Otherwise, it doesn't really make much sense.
Good.
All right, Olivia, where can people find
Me
you?
on social media at Weird Medieval, on Twitter at Weird Medieval, on at Weird Medieval Guys on Instagram. Aran.
I'm at Aaron P. Tappers on Twitter.
You can find me in the frozen wastes of the Arctic, looking for penguins. They gotta be around here somewhere, right? I heard they were full of it.
Yeah.
We're just around the corner of this ice floe.
The penguins are just around the corner. I think the mermen got them. But
No, tell them what you mean by that. Explain that. Elaborate on
Oh,
that.
do you mean the mermen who have horns on their heads and also as their legs?
oh well, we don't know whether their legs come down into a fin or a pointy shape like an arrow, because sadly their legs have never been witnessed.
But we definitely know that
seen-
people have seen them, so they're definitely
we've seen-
real.
We've seen their upper torsos, of which they have shoulders but no wrists. I don't know about the arms. And their heads above the forehead confined to a point, almost as if an
Narwhals!
icicle.
They're narwhals! It's obviously
They
narwhals!
talk about narwhals in the same source, Aaron.
Yeah, but this
How
guy-
can there be two things?
This
of the
guy's
same-
never seen a merman! He's combining two stories from different people! They're narwhals!
Right.